Good morning. Welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives. I'm Marian Ritigliano. We're going to talk about the SCUM Manifesto today by Valerie Solanas. Yeah, there you go. You might want to hold theirs up. And it's going to be really a radical feminist salon kind of discussion. Joe Brew, Caroline Norma, Sheila Jeffries, and Holly Lawford-Smith. The SCUM Manifesto was perhaps controversial back when it first came out in 1967, mostly because of its author, Valerie Solanas. And her life, I'll just briefly tell you about that, was pretty sad in many ways. She was born in 1936. She was sexually and physically abused as a child and a teenager. She left home at age 15. She got pregnant, had a child at age 17 who was taken away from her. She did graduate college, did a year of graduate school. After that, however, she's just panhandled and prostituted herself around the country, ending up in Greenwich Village in 1966. She wrote a play, which she gave a copy of the script to Andy Warhol to see if he would produce it. He didn't. She ultimately asked him for the play script back, but he said he lost it. So she kept calling him relentlessly over and over again, just pestering him with phone calls to give her money for the script. And she did, however, even perform in a couple of his films. And in 1967, she wrote the SCUM Manifesto, which she is best known for. That SCUM, S-C-U-M, in case you don't know, stands for Society for Cutting Up Men, which was the title of which and the concept was part of what made it so controversial. She said that, and it was widely discussed, at least where I was in New York City at the time, among women, among feminists, as a kind of just unusual, very unusual book. She said even some men, however, were interested in it, but that they were creeps, masochists, and wanted to kiss her feet. She was asked by a publisher to write a novel based on the SCUM Manifesto and even signed a contract to do that, which she never wrote. So she decided to because she wasn't writing it, she decided to shoot the publishing agent that she signed the contract with, and she thought that Andy Warhol was in league or was sort of partnered with the publisher, so she couldn't find the publishing agent, and she shot Andy Warhol instead. And he was there, so she shot him instead, as well as some person, another guy who was with Warhol at the time. She did turn herself in to the police, was initially declared incompetent, but ultimately sentenced to 3 years in prison, which was a short sentence for what she did, and it was primarily because Warhol refused to testify against her. And after that, she was in and out of mental institutions for the next 10 years, and then totally dropped off the grid for another 10 years. Nobody heard from her, and sadly died in 1988, broke and alone. She was 52 when she died of emphysema and pneumonia in San Francisco. So that is a very short synopsis of the sad life of Valerie Solanas. The book was variously described as just sort of, the ravings of an insane woman, as well as having some genuinely feminist ideas in it that were widely discussed, probably more widely discussed then than they are now. And I mean, she starts out with like a battle cry saying that to be male is to be deficient, emotionally limited. Maleness is a deficiency disease, and males are emotional cripples. And she does have some insights that maybe we all have, or maybe women didn't at the time, as to what male socialization is. And she says that the male is completely egocentric. He's trapped inside himself. He's incapable of empathizing or identifying with others, of love, friendship, affection, or tenderness. His responses are entirely visceral, not cerebral. His intelligence is a mere tool in the service of his drives and needs. He's incapable of mental passion, mental interaction. He can't relate to anything other than his own physical sensations. And she goes on to note that men are obsessed with sex because they're filled with a vast, pervasive, diffuse sexuality, but that a man is psychically passive, so that he's obsessed with sex to prove that he is not passive and that he is not a woman. But she says that men want to be women. And this is a theme that kind of works its way through the whole book, that men want to be women and that they are incomplete females, and they spend their lives attempting to complete themselves by becoming female. And they try to claim what she says are female characteristics of emotional strength, independence, forcefulness, decisiveness, coolness, objectivity, assertiveness, courage, and versus what she calls male traits of vanity, frivolity, triviality, and weakness. And that sex, therefore, for men is a defense against their desire to be female. So I think two of the things that we can start off with are one, is a genuine recognition of what male socialization is and how important that is when we talk about relationships with men, or why men are what they are, why they do what they do, how they come up with capitalism, how they came up with pornography, because all of that came, is a result of men. It doesn't cause men. It was her view. So who wants to start the ball rolling? And the other thing besides male socialization is this thing that they're really female, which is kind of an odd thing. Do I have to call on people?
Yeah, I'll say. So a thing I thought was very interesting, apart from what Marion said, is that she talks about structures in society, and she has some interesting insights. She says that there's a thing called the father system, and she sort of basically seems to be saying that fatherhood is an institution of patriarchy, and so it's rather than saying the family, she's just saying the whole thing about creation of the concept and the system of fatherhood. She calls it the fatherhood system. It's an interesting way of looking at it, causes lots of problems. And she says it is the increase in fatherhood resulting from the increased and more widespread affluence that fatherhood needs in order to thrive that has caused the general increase in mindlessness and decline of women in the United States since the 1920s. The close association of affluence with fatherhood has led, for the most part, to only the wrong girls, namely the privileged middle-class girls, getting educated. And then she says, the effect of fathers, in sum, has been to corrode the world with maleness. The male has a negative Midas touch. Everything he touches turns to shit. And I found that really interesting, because actually locating the problem in the fatherhood system. So that was an insight I enjoyed in her work.
I would just want to say something, I guess, about the male socialization thought. I feel like it's not entirely explicit in the work whether she thinks it's biological and irredeemable versus socialized in from birth as a matter of the cultural system as it is now. It seems like she leans toward the biological and irredeemable, given that her whole program seems to be like getting rid of men and building this sort of female supremacist or matriarchal society. So I was sort of reading her as having that view. It's difference feminism writ large. Females have all these amazing properties, probably biologically. Males have all these shit ones. And then the great reversal, which I think ties into what Marion mentioned about the men wanting to be women. It's not what we think of today, right, as men wanting to be women. It's rather men deep down know that they are shit and they recognize that women have all these superior qualities, and that it's just been this thousands of years sham to present themselves as having all the good qualities that women really have, and to denigrate women as having all the shit qualities that men really have. So it's like she doesn't sort of give the details, but in a way she's telling this like female supremacist, matriarchal, huge amount of propaganda story about what the world is really like. And so the idea that men want to become women is just the idea that men know their shit and want to become great. That's how I was sort of understanding it.
Well, yeah, I mean, she does say that throughout the book, is they know their shit, things like that. Yeah. The fatherhood thing. I mean, she grew up. She was born in 1946, grew up in the 50s. She talks about fatherhood, that fathers really don't want what's best for their kids. They just want peace and quiet and being respected and status. as well as the opportunity to control and manipulate, and that they use approval and disapproval and just being this sort of little monarch within the home. And she says that men want to attach themselves to women to complete themselves because they know that that they're incomplete, that they're incomplete human beings, is what she says at one point. Yeah, Sheila.
Sheila, you're on mute.
Unmute yourself, Sheila.
Yeah. She says, in relation to fatherhood, which I agree is very important in the book, she says, his daughter, she's saying the fathers want the daughters sexually. She says, he gives her hand in marriage. The other part is for him, which I think is an absolutely devastating line. And of course, she was sexually abused by her father and her grandfather. So it's understandable that she absolutely hates fatherhood and family and all of that stuff. But in terms of her understanding a bit more about class structure, so that is useful for now, I'm not completely sure she did, because she was totally into the individual. She was against community. She says the basis of all human life should be the individual. She hates the family. She hates couples. So that's rather against her understanding structures politically, I think. Anyway.
The other fascinating thing I thought was that we have so few accounts of sexuality in radical feminism. But if we say what the main account might be, it would be something like, men are oversexed, men center sex acts and sexual rituals and sexuality and everything in a society in order to realize their class status and to feel their class status and to perpetuate it and all that kind of that. Like, we have that logic about what sexuality is and how it's constructing the gender hierarchy. But in her case, like, this is all about, it's wonderful because it's all about sexuality. She describes society as designed and arranged for the purpose of achieving men's sexual aims, which is right, except that it's completely the opposite, because she says that they need to, hump themselves to death, and constantly get access to women in order to, try and avoid the fact of their, genetic deficiencies and inability to, they don't have the capacity for emotional connection with anyone else, and they can't feel themselves emotionally. And so this kind of the compulsive and the obsessive sex acts that we know of male society has a different explanation, but nonetheless it still organises society in this account of it, which I think was really interesting. But obviously we have a different account of how sexuality organises society. It's kind of the opposite account, I suppose.
She does talk about men basing everything on sex, philosophy, religion, morality, which is just sort of like the germ that or the seed that Andrea Dworkin poured water on and grew as the eroticization of women's oppression. Everything is based on sexuality, philosophy, religion, morality. And she talks a lot about the money work system, that we make money, we go to work, and that this money work system. Why do men maintain this money work system? She said it was for, to obtain women sexually, although women have to be coerced or bribed into male company to maintain the delusion that they have some kind of usefulness, for power and control as a substitute for love, because they can't give love or affection. So they give money, and that their goal becomes more and more money. And like Joe referred to, fatherhood, which is a male's major opportunity to control and manipulate. So all of that is just, she kind of, knew that sexuality was at the basis of it and didn't quite put it as, like I said, Andrea Dworkin did.
I would disagree with that, because I agree. She says that it's a lot to get pussy, as she says, but in her,
I don't know if we could say that.
Well, yeah, we can. I think we can. Maybe we can't. Maybe we'll get banned from Facebook or whatever, from YouTube now. But on page 5, she gives a list of all the different things that she thinks why society is structured as it is. And she says, 1, men set it up so that the money work system, so that they can get sex. But secondly, she says, supply the non-relating male with the delusion of usefulness. And she goes, I think, just as much as them wanting to do sex with women, they want to fill the void because they don't, they can't relate to people and they don't have a meaningful life. They're sort of empty inside. And she says a bit later on that the male likes death, it excites him sexually, and already dead inside, he wants to die. And quite a lot of her argument is that they can't actually just be happy, whereas women, if you just leave them on their own, they'll go and do some fun things. These, she calls it, sort of groove with others and lays about and sort of sing songs and stuff, whereas she says that just men just actually are incapable of that, which is interesting. But and then Holly wanted to say something, didn't you?
Well, this was just coming back to Caroline's point about sexuality. I just thought there was this very interesting point on, I think, page 9 of the PDF, where she writes about, can I read a little bit? Just a couple of lines?
Good, of course, yes.
So she says, the female can easily, far more easily than she may think, condition away her sex drive, leaving her completely cool and cerebral and free to pursue truly worthy relationships and activities. But the male, who seems to dig women sexually and who seeks out constantly to arouse them, stimulates the highly sexed female to frenzies of lust, throwing her into a sex bag from which few women ever escape. And I thought that was so interesting, just in the sense that it almost implies chastity is like a path to freedom, which is a kind of unpopular, I mean, it would be very unpopular to feminists today, right? Given all the sort of sex positivity. And I think even to like separatists or lesbian feminists, and maybe we can argue about that, but I just thought there was a striking, like the man is luring the woman by getting her aroused and then getting her to keep having sex. But if she could just step away from that, she'd be free.
In this copy I've got, that's not in there, which is really interesting. So I think there's like slightly different editing. So I'm going to get the PDF and check it. So if anyone's reading it, have a double check that. That's interesting.
Interesting.
So men luring women into sex. You know, I heard a woman who had left her childhood religion once, talking about the book of Genesis, and that one of the curses put upon Eve is that women would desire their husbands, so that women's sexual desire for men was a punishment on all women forever for what Eve did in the Garden of Eden. So, all right, that's a story, but I thought that a very, very interesting perspective that I think that probably more women understand as relevant to themselves, than we think. But the other thing about men is that women, we'd be happy to just go off by ourselves. I mean, when women hate something, we just want it to go away and leave us alone. When men hate something, they want to invade and violate it. And she even talks about that. She says, men have no regard for women's privacy. They see nothing wrong in intruding themselves on any woman's thought, and they don't understand why anyone would prefer to be alone rather than with men. So they seek to isolate. She says they seek to isolate women from other men, although I don't think she anticipated how much more men want to isolate women from each other. Yeah, Sheila. You're on mute, Sheila.
The chastity stuff that Holly was just talking about, which I think is very, very interesting in the book. I mean, you can exactly see where it comes from, because, of course, she was unbelievably sexually abused in prostitution as well as in childhood by various men. But it also seemed to me quite modern, because we've got movements in Korea and now China of women actually separating themselves from men and going for chastity, some of them becoming lesbians, but also just saying they're not going to do it anymore. And they're also back at the end of the 19th century, theosophist women like Frances Swiney and others, even though they were married, committed to never doing sexual intercourse with their husbands. They thought it was lead to them having higher functions and spiritual connections and so on. They were absolutely determined not to do that thing. So this has happened before, this line of thinking, but I agree that it's not really common in feminism these days for women to be talking about that, but it has periodically been so. But before we leave the issue of men and male sexuality, I think that there's this wonderful little quote in the book which shows, I think, her power to write. And it's a tragedy, really. She wasn't able to write more and write novels and write other things, because she's talking about male sexuality and how they can't help themselves but go towards women. She says that they are obsessed with screwing. He'll swim a river of snot, wade nostril deep through a mile of vomit, if he thinks there'll be a friendly pussy awaiting him. Now, I really think that's incredibly powerful writing, and nobody's quite doing anything quite like that. So there is an extraordinary emotional strength and fury in her writing, and a power of words, which I think is, incredibly impressive. Nobody's writing quite like that.
I think also, it reminds me a bit of Andrea Dworkin,
Yes.
who had very close contact with a lot of men sexually, sort of either in prostitution or just in life, in relationships, and really, really having lived it and being so angry, they're just not holding back, just going to say what they think, because of having seen so closely some of the very bad bits. Can I read a bit, because I think it's just good it's nice for the women who haven't read it yet or want to be reminded. There's a nice bit on page 3. It says, completely egocentric, this is Solanas' very good writing, I think. Completely egocentric, unable to relate, empathize or identify, and filled with a vast, pervasive, diffuse sexuality, the male is psychically passive. He hates his passivity, so he projects it onto women, defines the male as active, and then sets out to prove he's a man. His main means of attempting to prove it is screwing, big man with big dick tearing off a big piece. Since he's attempting to prove an error, he must prove it again and again. Screwing then is a desperate, compulsive attempt to prove he's not passive, not a woman. But he is passive, and then she says, and does want to be a woman. So, which she keeps repeating, that she thinks that they basically just want to be women, which, anyway, it's her writing.
Yeah, that part that kept winding its way through there about men wanting to be women, had some discussion, but caused people to sort of disregard some of the other things they were saying, because it didn't make sense to a lot of people. And I think we understand it better now. I heard Caroline, you wanted to?
Yeah, I think you're right, Marianne. We do understand it better now, just because, like Sheila was saying, with the South Korean feminists, I think that what they call mirroring, which is kind of, doing exactly what Solanas does here, which is patriarchal, or exposing the patriarchal reversal, where the very attributes that men attribute to women are actually ones held by themselves. They're the ones that they harbour, but they attempt to enculturate through fatherhood, enculturate, for example, daughters with the idea that they've got the masterful qualities of emotion and cool-headedness and logic and objectivity, whereas actually in Solanas' account it's the opposite, and that's got some kind of genetic deficiency basis. But even in radical feminism that doesn't find its origin stories in that kind of genetic deficiency. People like Mary Daly might find origin stories in, ancient Mesopotamia or somewhere like that, but it still comes to the same thing, where it's this patriarchal reversal or mirroring. And we've seen, like South Korea, they were massively successful through their mirroring efforts. And I'll quickly read this. So on that point, just a further point, what Solanas thinks is that what we think of today is sort of, and I don't like this language, I'll just say it, but handmaidens or fembots, or that kind of social media denigration of women. She does the same thing, except with really amazing writing, but different from, I think, Betty Friedan's Feminine Mystique from 1963, so it's published before this pamphlet. My reading of that book is that Frieden just outright blames women for their situation at that time. I'm sure others probably have a different view, but I don't think Frieden ever gives us an idea of why women, going back in the home and enjoying all the household delights. But Solanas does blame these so-called daddy's girls, so women that have aligned their loyalties and their values and accommodationists in relation to men. She calls them daddy's girls, and she says that's through fatherhood that they're enculturated among other social systems. And on page 12, she describes them, and this is where her writing really comes out. She describes them as passive, rattle-headed daddy's girl, ever eager for approval, for a pat on the head, for the respect of any passing piece of garbage, is easily reduced to mama, mindless administrator to physical needs, soother of the weary, achy brow, booster of the puny ego, appreciator of the contemptible, a hot water bottle with tits. And that's not nice to either read or hear. But just, I don't know, I had a lot of sympathy for Solanas because she, at a number of points in the manifesto, she really does say, no, women all, there's another point later on where she says, no, women given a chance or given a different society with women, they will step forward for us. It's only because they've been enculturated. These daddy's girls, she doesn't assign any kind of inexorable sort of entity to them, which is good. I thought a bit better than Betty Friedan, I thought, on that point at least.
Wow, that was a lot, Caroline. Just starting where you took off, I know it was unclear, Holly, whether she considered male socialization biological versus social. I don't know if there's any evidence that it's biological. We certainly see it as a cultural thing, a social thing that may vary from culture to culture, but still has male domination in its essence. But female socialization is actually part of male socialization. That's what men have decided women, girls, females will be socialized into. So male socialization talks about domination, violation of boundaries, entitlement. But what it also talks about is here's our female auxiliary, and here's how they will be socialized. I mean, that's women. Women made. Women socialize the girls that they have. That they give birth to according to what men have decided women should be. Does that make sense? I mean, and so she goes on after a while to say that okay, so maybe women shouldn't give birth anymore. Whether to continue to use females for reproduction or to reproduce in the laboratory will become academic. She wanted every girl, every female age 12 or older to be on the pill, and that when women are fully conscious, they won't want to give birth anymore. She says the answer is in the laboratory production of babies, which echoes some of what Firestone said as well, and that women at least should not reproduce males. Yeah.
I guess I'm just wondering, it still seems to be an open question whether this strategy is instrumental. Like, we're in a social situation now all around the world where men do this socializing of women to make them a certain way, have these negative traits that they don't really have, and men think they're superior. It seems to me it would still be possible for her to think it's not biological, it's not innate, and it's not inevitable, but we would need a real rupture to change things. So like for at least the next 200 years, no male babies, no like whatever else, like kill all men, like to take the power back and really change society. But I just don't see evidence that she thinks necessarily once you've changed society in that radical way, you couldn't start having male babies again, and you couldn't enculturate or socialize differently. I'm not sure.
I don't know. But you talk about a rupture in society. Remember the 10, 15 years ago now, about the male baboons in Kenya. It's like we're talking about men, so baboons naturally come up. So the scientists studied this troop or tribe of baboons in an area of Kenya, and the feeding went by. The aggressive males just got as much of the food as possible. And they were feeding from this garbage dump, which was infected, and all the aggressive male baboons died. Like that was half of the male baboons. I mean, they all died. And from then on, completely, the troop changed. The females became, became dominant, and the males who were left were, were passive, were, more acculturated as like female baboons. And any young male baboons who joined that troop thereafter were acculturated and socialized into, what was then female baboon, values. And it even spread to other troops, which is pretty. I mean, that's a deep rupture. I mean, she just says that women should simply leave men. If all women simply left men, refused to have anything to do with any men, with all men, the government and national economy would collapse. And then she reiterates that men really want to be led by women, so that the conflict is really between, as you said, and as Caroline said, between SCUM, these dominant, secure, self-confident, independent, proud women, and nice, passive, accepting, polite, subdued. And again, I hate the term handmaidens, but it kind of fits in this case.
But she seems to have a vision of a pretty pleasant utopia, right? So once all the men are gone, we've gotten rid of work, women are just doing enjoyable, creative leisure time and having meaningful emotional connections with other women. Like that is a sort of particular view of women's real nature, or like humans' real nature, once you got rid of men propagandizing everything. And I just think it's interesting. The baboon example might suggest there's actually going to be like a will to domination or a will to power, and you can just flip who has the privilege of occupying those roles. And I don't necessarily think it would be a better world or a genuine utopia if we just flipped and had women being the jerks. So again, it's super speculative.
Well, the female baboons weren't the jerks. They just made a more egalitarian, gentle baboon society.
So what Solanas says on page 23 in this book, this one, which is, it sort of relates to what we're talking about what would it be like if we women could relate to each other, and what could a new society be like? She says currently one of the things that the male-dominated society, or the men, do is they do prevention of friendship, and then she says in brackets love. Then she says men have contempt for themselves for all other men, and they basically everybody has contempt for each other. But then she says love is not dependency or sex, so how it's constructed, but friendship, and therefore love can't exist between two males, between a male and a female, or between two females, one or both of whom is a mindless, insecure, pandering male. That's the sort of male identified female who's daddy's girl, that sort of stuff. And then she goes, like conversation, love can exist only between two secure, freewheeling, independent, groovy females, since friendship is based on respect, not contempt. And then she goes on about this fantastic groovy female thing. I think one of the things, I mean, I read this in the sort of mid-80s, and I remember thinking it was delightful, her vision of us, of a reality that females could have, that we could have if we were liberated from being daddy's girls and thinking we could have love with males, or these daddy's girls females, and the really great friendship, so it's not sex or dependency, and love is between two sort of liberated women, the groovy females. But she also makes it really fun. Like she says, it's groovy, and then we're just going to laze about because there won't be any work left, because the reason there's work is for men to be able to control us and get access. So we don't actually need to be working, which I think is an insight that many people know in lots of different ways. It's just not necessary, this ridiculous amount of work we do. And she sort of says it in her way, but it's very, very sort of, it's just hopeful. Bits of what she writes are really lovely.
Sheila, yeah. Unmute yourself.
After that delightful bit, I think it would be good to talk about what's seen as the main problem with SCUM, which is the fact that she hates men. Now, interestingly, Kathleen Richardson in the chat has just said, and I think it's a really, really good point, men are writing their SCUM manifestos towards women all the time. And there's a pornography industry, which is absolutely, absolutely horrifying. Hatred on an unbelievable scale. Now, what's shocking about SCUM is that she does hate men, there's no question about it, and she thinks they should be destroyed, and in various ways they should not exist, but it's in no way on the scale of what men feel towards women. And I think I just should read just a lovely bit towards the end, where she says how men should be helped to eliminate themselves. There should be a men's auxiliary to SCUM. SCUM was only her, by the way, there wasn't any other organization. There should be a men's auxiliary to SCUM, in which men will, of course, learn how to eliminate themselves, because it's best if they do it to themselves. But she also says, and I just love this, she says, to aid men in this endeavor, that is getting rid of themselves, various other jobs as well, SCUM will conduct turd sessions, turd is in capital letters, at which every male present will give a speech beginning with the sentence, "I am a turd, a lowly abject turd," and then proceed to list all the ways in which he is a turd. Which I think is just marvelous. And back in the 1970s, of course, there were anti-sexist men's groups that men got together, and they basically did talk about how they were turds, you know, they talk about sex, how they were sexist towards women and all that sort of thing, but not with the aim of eliminating themselves, which was Valerie Solanas. So this is, what's so extraordinary is that this hatred was seen as extraordinary in a way, because back in the 1970s too, women wrote papers on man-hating and about how that was completely reasonable. If you think what men have done to women over centuries and millennia, and the horrific crimes and the horrific way that they treat women, why not man-hating would be extraordinary. And yet we're in a society in which apparently not man-hating is the thing to do, and hating men is terribly, terribly unacceptable, but for men to hate us, it's completely acceptable. So I think that's an interesting concept, really, for looking at her work. It's been remembered because of the extraordinary strength of the man-hating. That's what made it controversial at the time. That's what makes it controversial now. And yet many other women in the 1970s were saying, how could you not hate men, in fact? But these days, it's very, 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 very different. There mustn't be any discussion of this at all.
Okay. Anybody want to comment on that? It is. I mean, it was. You can't say that anymore. That used to be a point of feminist discussion about do we hate men? Is it men in a class? What about individual men? And now it's framed as, you know, what she called daddy's girls are, you know, but I found one of the good ones. I mean, Mary Daly talks about that too. It's, you know, name the problem, and it's all of them. You know, she, near the end, the turd sessions are in what she was describing as the SCUM auxiliary for men, which I think was a wonderful, I hate to say, reversal of a reversal, because whenever men do something, it's, you know, there's always, oh, well, there's a women's auxiliary and they have cake sales and things like that. But she also, I mean, she also talked about what we could do about it, and you know, what kind of revolution we could have. Yes, they're incapable of love on an individual basis, and she talks about respect as being the foundation of friendship. I have heard people in long-term relationships talking about respect, really, you know, they don't talk about love, they talk about respect as being the foundation of love. But she says that there needs to be some kind of social revolution for this, and that it can't be accomplished by men, because the male on top always wants the status quo, and the male on the bottom wants to be the male on top, and women are just always below it all. So she near the end talks about what SCUM can do on a practical basis, and this is the stuff that really, aside from the man hating, which is sort of like pervasive through the whole book, she says that SCUM can take over the country by systematically can I say fucking up, or do I have to say effing up the system? By systematically fucking up the system, by selectively destroying property, and she said by murder as well. And obviously people looked at that and said, no, that's insane. Perhaps systematically fucking up the system had some measure of credence to it. I mean, there were certainly, when labor unions were strong, felt it was perfectly okay and necessary to fuck up the, a capitalist system. But she said that that's what SCUM should do, and that was the source. In it, even going beyond the man hating, that was the source of a lot of the controversy that women should be doing all these things, fucking up the system, destroying property, killing men. Very, very controversial. But even as like straightforward a thing as just hating your oppressors was seen to be as, how could you possibly do that?
I'll just make a small comment on that. I don't know if anyone in the panel knows, but it would be interesting to compare the level of public outrage against civil rights activists who advocated for violence as a means to the end, given how much violence they were facing, and sort of compare that public reaction of outrage to what the feminists were getting. My suspicion would be that it would be seen as more justified in the anti-racism case than it would be in the feminism case, because it's just more shocking to see violence being incited by or advocated by women. I don't know if that's historically correct. I just think it would be interesting because the mechanisms that are being advocated for are kind of similar. Like, you can use violence in self-defense when you are being violently oppressed. But yeah, I don't know the answer. I just think it would be interesting to compare the two.
Yeah, I mean, I like, say, Malcolm X, who wasn't miles away temporally from her, has sort of been taken up as justified rebel. So it is an interesting similarity. And a thing I was going to say, which is slightly not related to what Holly's just said, is that one thing I always have really, really liked about this book is that there are no academic citations. And she looks as if she wrote it in a couple of, I mean, it's actually quite very well written, and she's a very good writer, but it looks as if she might have written it in about 3 days when she was absolutely livid. And it makes writing and talking about how you feel about things accessible. It makes it less, I mean, which is really in our sort of radical feminist tradition of, you don't have to be meticulously citing things, and it's sort of a messy process of just get it all out there in your rage, and some of it's going to be amazing. And I think that I love that because it's sort of liberating in a way of saying, okay, it might not all be right, we might not agree with some of the things she said, but it's a sort of blaze of insight, and it's seeing how angry lots of women are. She really speaks, lots of what she's saying sort of really touches us. So but I love the non-academicness of it, although of course I love all these academics who are on the panel being so academic as well, which is great.
Yeah, it's like, go ahead.
I was just going to say, just in terms of mentioning another resource, there's a book that I'm sure you all know, but maybe some in the audience don't, called For Lesbians Only. And it's a collection, and it just has that flavor that Joe just described. Like, it's quite non-academic in most of the contributions. There's a lot of like rage and inspiration. And there's also this theme of like kind of justified man-hating, and that sort of similar rage comes through. So if people are looking for like similar things to look at once they've read SCUM Manifesto, that would be a good place to go.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a spontaneous thing that she probably, I don't know how, you're right, Josie, it looks like it was written in a few days. And it did not have the quality that Marilyn Fry did when trying to tell women you were really in a cage by describing the cage. And if you only see, one little bar of the cage, you don't know that the other bars are so close together that you can never get out. I mean, that's very, she developed that idea. This is just like trying to shake women and say, look, this is what they're doing to us. It's okay to hate. It's okay to hate them. It's okay to hate them. This is what they are doing to us. This is why they are doing it to us. And coming up with her theory about why they are like that. You look, Sheila, like you've got something on your mind.
No, and not necessarily. No.
Wow.
I don't see the hating in it. I don't. Yeah, I don't see the hating. I see she's funny, so it's not. I think a lot of her texts are not like Dworkin and not like kind of the Me Too movement. That's very, in a good way, no criticism, very earnest, and really brings the oppression, heavy down on readers. Like the beauty of this manifesto is it's funny. The turd jokes just keep on coming. I'll read out one little other bit, and there's a big section in the middle of the manifesto where she picks at pokes fun at disciplines like Holly Lawford-Smith's discipline, for example, which we all enjoyed so much, but also pokes fun at the art world, which I really loved too. And so she says, this is of the men, with the feminine qualities of the men, they can pride themselves on their ability to appreciate the finer things, to see a jewel where there is only a turd, and they want to be admired for admiring. Lacking faith in their ability to change anything, resigned to the status quo, they have to see beauty in turds because, so far as they can see, turds are all they'll ever have. Yeah, there was many funny bits that I enjoyed.
Is this maybe a good time to, if Caroline, if you have it to hand, to mention the Chesler point? Because I was just going to say, I think that's, whether it's funny or whether it's incitement to violence, maybe is a good question that comes from how some feminists received it at the time, right? And so I don't know, do you have that passage to hand? Maybe we can.
Which passage, Holly?
From Phyllis Chesler's memoir.
Oh, yeah, I do.
Yeah.
Or I did. Should I read the whole thing, or?
Well, maybe the part about
I can tell you that, for example, her place, in or what she was thought of is that Florence Kennedy and T. Grace Atkinson embraced Solanas as a symbol of feminist militancy and rushed to her side. They claimed Solanas as one of ours. They visited her in jail. Both of Flo and T. Grace were identified with Now. Their attempt to present what Phyllis Chesler called a mentally ill criminal, which is possibly true, as a feminist hero made Betty Friedan crazy. Betty viewed Solanas as a man-hating lunatic, not as a feminist hero, and Betty feared that Now would be seen as supporting the murder of men. Yes, Solanas's acts could be interpreted in feminist terms and as such exploited by feminists, but Solanas herself was not a feminist. I would take issue with that. I think she was, whether she knew it or not. And then Chesler goes on to say that Solanas acted irrationally and without a goal and represented no one but herself. Solanas hotly denied any association with feminism, which I find odd, which he described as a civil disobedience lunch club. Touche, Valerie Solanas, touche. And I understand, I guess, to not identify with the feminism of Now at that time, I can understand why she would distance herself from that.
Yeah, so I just kind of wanted to mention on that because it seems like there's two ways to read the text, right? One is really like quite serious. I mean, we're inciting violence against men. We're hoping that more women will become scum. And the other is like doing these much more clever, like it's funny, it's satirical. And she's taking, like, she's performing something that men have been doing for thousands of years to women, right? Like overconfidently pronouncing on the nature of woman. And then she's suddenly there overconfidently pronouncing on the nature of man. It's like, that's great. That's so cool and interesting to read, the audacity of that. So I don't know, there's this question, how seriously to take it and in what spirit? And I think that spoke to how the feminists were arguing about it at that time.
Yeah, but her solution to it, near the end, she talks about, well, what do we do about it? And then, her solution was that three-pronged, systematically fucking up the system, selectively destroying property, murder. And she said, and this, I think, we've certainly heard, you can certainly read in a lot of other places, is that dropping out is not the answer, fucking up is. And you hear that discussed when women discuss things like separatism and how separate should we be, separating ourselves, simply abandoning men, simply abandoning things. But she says, no, screw up the system. And that SCUM should operate on a criminal as opposed to a civil disobedience basis, and that SCUM is out to destroy the system, not to attain certain rights within it, which addresses something we were talking before, that it's not a question of merely replacing women with men in a structure that violates and dominates and fosters the exploitations of capitalism and such. That was her solution, is to fuck up the system. Yeah, Joe.
But she does also say on page 36 in this one, she says, if all women simply left men, refused to have anything to do with them ever, all men, the government and the national economy would collapse completely. And, when I read that, I think, yeah, they're going to fight back. The men aren't going to let us do that. There's going to be violence against us to stop us do that. But she does articulate that. And you could say that's a sort of separatist, well, it is a separatist statement. Let's just leave them. So she does pose that as one possibility. The other thing she says, in terms of her not just being an individual, although I agree with what Sheila said, is that she's very individualistic and she's saying most of these structures are not good. But she does say at one stage, this is page 42, looking inside yourself for salvation, contemplating your navel is not, as dropout people would have you believe, the answer. Happiness lies outside yourself, is achieved through interacting with others. And so as you read the text, you see that she has quite a lot of it's contradictory, but she does understand that working together and being in relation with others, in these respectful, loving relations with others, is very important. And then she says men can't do that, so that's why they're just not able to. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, that was part of what she was talking about men wanting to isolate women, and she said isolate women from other men, but it's really about trying to isolate women from other women. That she knew what the danger of that was for men. Yeah, Sheila.
Can I just carry on with Joe's point there, talking about how she was saying women should just withdraw the men and the economic system will collapse and male supremacy will collapse? Well, that was a very common idea in the 1970s. The discussions we used to have, there was the 1975 women's strike in Iceland, where women just withdrew their labor for a day on the grounds that capitalism would grind to a halt, which I'm sure that it did. But far beyond that, of course, because thousands and thousands of us were separating ourselves from men by becoming lesbian feminists and separatists, we did talk about how all women actually became lesbian feminists and separatists. Obviously, male domination would collapse, and that was our goal in the 1970s. We were reasonably serious that we could make this happen. And we were so serious at that time that we talked about what would the men do? Well, they'd take up arms against us. There's no question about that. They have the power and there's no way we could work as an organized front against them. But at the same time, there were women, I was not one of them, who were saying that we should have guns ourselves. I'm saying all of this because it is so very, very, very different now. The sort of feminism that we have right now, nobody's talking about smashing the system, making it collapse. Virtually nobody's talking about the fact that there is a system at all. So there's very much less anger around, much less seriousness in that sense now than there was in the 1970s. So Solanas was fitting into something that we were seriously talking about at that time. So I suspect that she might look more strange now than she did at that time when I first came across her in 1973 and so on.
You talk about her being very individualist, but she really does talk about women as a class. She really does. I obviously wonder what she would think about liberal feminism now being so focused on the individual and this is empowering, that's empowering. She probably would think it was BS. It was total nonsense. There is a question. It's actually a two-parter in the Q&A that maybe we can just touch on briefly because I do hear women asking about it. Someone asks, what do you make of the theory that SCUM was intended as a parody of Freud's essays? And second question, I read somewhere that SCUM is basically Freud with the women and men swapped. Is this quite accurate? Well, I have heard that, and I've heard people say that before. I don't see it. I mean, is there anyone who thinks that she might have, that's what she might have been attempting? Yeah, I mean, Joe, you're muted.
Yeah, so I've got to, it's not answering that. I don't see that. I think it came from her and it came from the women's movement, and I just think she probably vaguely didn't like Freud, but I don't think it was aimed. It wasn't a close fight, sort of answer to him. A thing that I found, another thing I found interesting in the text is she says on page 18, it's that there's no reason why a society consisting of rational beings capable of emphasizing with each other, complete and having no natural reason to compete, so they're complete people and they don't need to compete, should have a government, laws or leaders. So it's like just one sentence. She's basically saying, if we don't need any of this, we don't need these hierarchies, we don't actually need government, so sort of like we could just organize naturally, we'd just be grooving or whatever, and there'd be everything for everybody. We wouldn't need laws or leaders. It's just really sort of interesting intellectually to think, wow, yeah, like for the first time you read it, you sort of think, yeah, maybe she's right. Maybe we don't need any of this. It's all just a structure of patriarchy. And that's lovely.
Yeah. It was a follow-up to something she said on the previous page, having no sense of right or wrong, no conscience, which can only stem from an ability to empathize with others, having no faith in his non-existent self, being necessarily competitive, and by nature unable to cooperate, the male feels a need for external guidance and control. So he created authorities, and that men's relationship to women is strictly based on this control and authority, wanting the female mama to guide him, but unable to accept the fact that he is, after all, a man wanting to play woman, to usurp her function as guider and protector. He sees to it that all authorities are male, that men cannot see that we could have a society where females, neither males nor females, are in charge. Yeah, Sheila.
Yeah, I think that what's different now from the time that she wrote that and from the 70s and the 80s is that women are not talking about male domination as a whole system and how to bring it down. And that's really, really, really not happening. I mean, in the present, we're supposed to believe that it is good in schools to teach children about pornography and how that might be harmful. So children must be introduced to pornography for their own protection at a very early age. Nobody's talking about bringing down the system. I mean, it constantly absolutely astonishes me the degree to which now the answer is to get everybody acculturated to the horrors of male supremacy as young as possible. But once upon a time, we talked about the system and how to bring it down. And of course, we had consciousness raising groups and little groups in which we talked about these things, and the ideas would go wild, and we think about what could we imagine? How was the future? How do we make it happen? None of that happens now. Social media seems to make it quite impossible to have those sort of conversations. We're not meeting in person where our imaginations can go wild. But how do we get back to that possibility, I think, is a really good question.
Okay, we are just about done. In the last minute or so, does anybody have any burning desires to share a particular insight? No burning desires? All right. I think it's a wonderful book. I am.
Marion, can I just read the first sentence? It's like as good. I think this is really good. That's I just think, like the Communist Manifesto, there is a spectre haunting Europe, the spectre of communism. It's such a key sentence, but this, I love this. It says,
it's great.
It's so famous and it's so wonderful. It goes, life in this society being at best an utter bore, and no aspect of society being at all relevant to women, there remains to civic-minded, responsible, thrill-seeking females only to overthrow the government, eliminate the money system, institute complete automation, and destroy the male sex. It's sort of like a pretty amazing first. It's one sentence. It's so much in it. But
and the rest of the book is just expanding on that. I mean, it encapsulates the whole rest of the book and is a wonderful way to end with the first sentence. Thank you all for being here. Valerie Solanas, the SCUM Manifesto.
Right. Bye.
Bye-bye.